Jonathan Reed had just returned from a long business trip, but the moment he stepped into his luxurious mansion in Evanston, Illinois, he froze in place. Before his eyes was a scene that made his heart nearly stop beating. His 6-year-old daughter, Sophie Reed, in a torn, dirt-stained pink dress, was trembling as she clutched her 8-month-old baby brother, Daniel, tightly in her frail arms. Sophie's voice broke into sobs as she pleaded, "Please, don't hurt me and my brother anymore." That fragile sound echoed through the lavish house, yet cut into Jonathan's chest as sharply as a knife. And in that very moment, the dark secrets hidden within the Reed household began to unravel. Jonathan Reed, 43 years old, ran his empire from the top floor of Willis Tower in Chicago, one of America's most iconic skyscrapers. On his polished wooden desk, beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier, lay a gold-plated pen and towering stacks of documents. Every day, he signed papers like a machine. His tailored Italian suit fitted perfectly across his broad shoulders. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light with every turn, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed beneath the desk. Everything around him spoke of wealth, power, and success. Everything any American man might dream of. And yet, inside Jonathan's heart was a void nothing could fill. He had once known happiness. Laura, his first wife, had been the light of his life. Together they had Sophie, their first daughter, whose soft brown hair danced in the wind each time she played in the yard. And then came Daniel, their baby boy, born on the very day Laura left this world due to fatal hemorrhaging. For 8 long months, Jonathan had not once played with Sophie, nor had he ever held Daniel in his arms. He buried himself in work, in endless business trips and numbers, as though running from his grief. It was in that emptiness that Victoria Lang, Laura's longtime friend, appeared like an angel. With her sweet smile and gentle presence, carefully calculated, she entered the Reed household as a replacement mother, embracing both children with the appearance of unwavering devotion. Jonathan convinced himself that at least the children had a woman's presence at home, which had to be better than growing up with only a cold, distant father. That day, after an entire month away, Jonathan suddenly felt a surge of longing. He wanted to surprise his children. Closing the final file, he stood before the tall mirror. His stern face, his weary eyes, suddenly softened at the thought of Sophie running into his arms, or Daniel smiling when Jonathan held him for the first time. That thought alone pushed him to grab his coat and leave the office without telling his secretary. His luxury car sped down the highway from Chicago to Evanston. Soon, the grand mansion with its heavy iron gates came into view. Jonathan stepped inside, set his briefcase on the table, and removed his coat. But the house was far too silent. Then, from deeper within, came the sound of crying. At first, the weak wail of Daniel, and then Sophie's trembling voice. "Please, don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Jonathan froze. His blood ran cold. His feet felt like lead as he walked toward the living room, heart pounding with each step. Behind the door, the sight nearly crushed his breath. Sophie, her brown hair tangled, her clothes filthy, clutching Daniel desperately. And across from her stood Victoria Lang, the woman he once believed to be salvation. But her voice now was sharp, venomous. "Shut up! How many times have I told you? Don't bother me. If you keep crying, I'll throw both you and that baby out on the street." Jonathan rushed forward, placing himself between them, his voice hoarse but firm. "Stop!" The entire house seemed to shatter with that single shout. Jonathan Reed sat inside his cold office on the top floor of Willis Tower in Chicago. At 43, he owned a financial empire, running his company from a glass-walled room that overlooked the city skyline. On his polished wooden desk lay a gold-plated pen and a towering stack of documents. Day after day, Jonathan signed each page like a machine, beneath the dazzling light of the crystal chandelier, its reflection glinting on the Rolex around his wrist. His Italian-tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders perfectly. His polished leather shoes gleamed beneath the desk. Everything in that room screamed success, power, and wealth. The very things any American man might dream of. But inside, Jonathan felt empty. He had once known happiness. Laura, his first wife, was the light of his life. Sophie, their first daughter, used to run across the yard, her brown hair bouncing, her laughter ringing like bells. And then Daniel, their precious baby boy, was born into tragedy. Laura died of postpartum hemorrhage the very day he entered the world. 8 months had passed. Jonathan hadn't once sat down to play with Sophie, nor had he ever held Daniel in his arms. Instead, he buried himself in endless trips, contracts, and numbers, as though he could outrun grief itself. It was in that void that Victoria Lang appeared. Once Laura's close friend, she stepped into the Reed household with sweetness and care. To Jonathan, she seemed like a devoted woman, a salvation after loss. If Laura had been the light, then Victoria was the replacement angel, someone he trusted to care for the children while he was gone. Jonathan told himself, at least Sophie and Daniel had a woman at home, better than growing up with only a distant, cold father. He felt grateful that Victoria carried the burden he had abandoned. That day, after a month-long trip, Jonathan signed the last document and closed the file. Catching his reflection in the mirror, stern face, weary eyes, he suddenly softened. A fleeting thought crossed his mind: to go home early and surprise his children. Maybe Sophie would run into his arms. Maybe Daniel would smile the first time he held him. The thought warmed his heart in a way he hadn't felt for months. He grabbed his coat and left before his secretary could say a word. His luxury car sped out of Chicago, heading toward the grand mansion in Evanston, Illinois. A house once filled with laughter, now cloaked in silence, like dust settling on forgotten memories. The heavy iron gates creaked open. Jonathan stepped into the grand hall, where the golden chandelier light glowed against the marble floor. He set his briefcase on the table, took off his coat, but the stillness was suffocating. Then, faint but piercing, the sound of a child's cry. Jonathan froze, straining to hear. It was Daniel. Weak, broken cries echoing through the silence. And then another voice followed. Fragile, trembling, desperate. Sophie's voice. "Please, don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Jonathan's body locked. His heart nearly stopped. That was his daughter's voice, begging for mercy inside the very home meant to keep her safe. He walked slowly, each step heavy, following the sound down the hallway. He stopped just short of the living room door. What he saw made his breath seize. Sophie, only 6 years old, sat crumpled on the floor. Her pink dress was torn and filthy, her brown hair tangled, her small arms clutched Daniel tightly. The baby's face was red, his cries ragged. Sophie's tiny hands trembled as she tried to soothe him. And standing over them, Victoria Lang. The perfect contrast. Her blonde hair curled elegantly, her red dress clinging to her figure, her lips painted deep crimson. Her face was striking with heavy makeup, but her voice was sharp, venomous, like shards of glass. "Shut your mouth. How many times have I told you? Don't bother me. If you keep crying, I'll throw both you and the baby out on the street." Jonathan surged forward, throwing himself between her and the children. His voice cracked but rang firm. "Stop!" The house seemed to shatter with that single word. His movements clumsy, Jonathan reached out, awkwardly trying to take Daniel, the son he had never once held. Then he turned, voice softer, calling, "Sophie, come here to Daddy." The girl froze, clutching the hem of her dress, eyes wide with fear. Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering before retreating. All that remained was his instinct, to stand as a shield before his children. Victoria's eyes flickered with venom for a split second, before she masked it with a sweet smile. She touched his sleeve lightly, voice dripping with honey. "You're home early. I was only teaching them discipline. They've been too wild. You remember the doctor said, children need structure, don't you? I've been with them all month. I understand them better than you." She leaned closer, her tone silky, coaxing. "You're tired, Jonathan. Don't let childish whining upset you. Maybe you're just feeling guilty for being away too long. Let me handle everything." But in that brief moment, Jonathan caught it, the sheer panic in Sophie's eyes. A truth that no smile, no honeyed words could ever hide. Jonathan held Daniel tightly in his arms, his chest burning as if flames were searing through him when he saw the terror in Sophie's eyes. Yet Victoria still wore her sweet smile, her tilted gaze as if soothing a child rather than hiding the fury that had just erupted. "You came home early. What a surprise." "Let me ask the kitchen to prepare dinner," Victoria said softly, patting Jonathan's hand, as though the scene from moments ago had been nothing but an illusion. Jonathan nodded faintly, but inside it felt like 1,000 needles pricked at his heart. Moments later, the clatter of dishes came from the kitchen. It wasn't Victoria who appeared, but Dorothy Wilson, the aging housekeeper who had served the Reed family since Laura's days. She bowed to Jonathan, her expression calm, though her eyes carried a shadow of unease. Dinner was quickly set on the table. Golden light pooled over gleaming silverware, and the aroma of chicken soup filled the air. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, Victoria to his right, Sophie across from him, and Daniel in a small chair. The atmosphere seemed warm on the surface, but was heavy, suffocating beneath. "Eat up, darling, so you'll grow strong," Victoria cooed sweetly, placing a piece of meat into Sophie's bowl. Her smile glistened, but the hand she pressed onto the girl's shoulder bore down hard enough to make Sophie flinch, her spoon trembling violently. Jonathan leaned forward, watching more closely. On Sophie's left wrist, faint purple bruises surfaced, marks that could not be completely hidden. His heart pounded, his voice sank, slow and deliberate. "Sophie, has anyone at school been bullying you?" The girl startled, her eyes flashing fear before she lowered her gaze, whispering, "No, no, Father." Victoria laughed lightly, turning to Jonathan. "Children bump into each other all the time. Bruises are normal. I always remind her to be more careful." Jonathan said nothing, only spun his spoon slowly in his hand. A wave of guilt washed over him. 8 months he had been absent, blind to all of this. Suddenly, Daniel burst into tears, his small legs kicking, face flushed red. Victoria quickly stood, circling behind the chair to lift the boy. But her movements were rough, stripped of tenderness. Daniel screamed louder. "Give him to me!" Jonathan nearly shot to his feet, his voice hoarse with urgency. Victoria hesitated, then reluctantly handed Daniel over. Jonathan held him awkwardly, stiff as if his arms had forgotten how to cradle a child. But after a few steady pats on the boy's back, Daniel's cries softened into broken sobs. Jonathan bent close, whispering, "You're safe now. Daddy's here." The words startled him. How long had it been since he last spoke them? Sophie looked up, her wide eyes glimmering with the faintest spark of hope. Victoria quickly interjected, her voice sugary sweet. You see, children cry. It's nothing unusual. I've cared for them all month, Jonathan. Sometimes it's exhausting. You shouldn't be too tense. Jonathan didn't respond. He only tightened his hold on Daniel, his eyes fixed on Sophie's every tiny movement. When dinner ended, he spoke softly. I'll go upstairs to change. Sophie, remember to brush your teeth before bed. Yes, Father. Her reply was faint, her eyes blinking rapidly as though concealing something. Jonathan climbed the stairs, but at the fourth step, he froze. From below came the faint clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair. Then Victoria's voice dropped low, sharp as a blade. Listen carefully. If you dare breathe a word to your father, I swear I'll throw you and your brother out on the street. A silence followed. Then quick, shallow breaths, the sound of Sophie's fear, and her trembling voice broke the stillness. Please, please don't. I'll stay quiet. I promise. Jonathan stood paralyzed, his hand gripping the banister until his knuckles turned white. His heart thundered against his ribs, his throat constricted. Images sliced through his mind. Victoria's fake smile, the bruises on Sophie's wrist, Daniel's desperate cries, each piece fitting together into one undeniable truth. He drew in a deep breath, forcing the raging storm inside to stay contained. But one thing was now certain. He could not delay any longer. That night, Jonathan Reed barely slept. He sat alone in his study, the desk lamp casting a yellow glow across his rigid face. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie trembling in fear, Daniel wailing until his voice was hoarse, and Victoria's blade-like words. If you dare, open your mouth. When dawn broke, Jonathan descended into the kitchen. There stood Dorothy Wilson, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Reed family for over a decade, carefully placing dishes onto the wooden shelf. When she saw Jonathan, she froze, her thin hands halting midair. Jonathan lowered his voice, his gaze heavy. Dorothy, while I was away, how were the children? She bowed her head, silent for a long moment, torn between fear and duty. Finally, she exhaled a shaky sigh, her voice trembling. Do you want the truth, sir? Jonathan nodded. Only the truth. Dorothy clutched the cloth in her hands. Slowly, carefully, she spoke, each word dropping as if afraid to fall. There were nights when Miss Victoria made little Sophie stand on the porch for hours, just for dropping a spoon. Once, I found her clutching her baby brother asleep in the storage room because their bedroom had been locked. Daniel was often given nothing but watered-down milk. He cried from hunger until he passed out. I tried to intervene, but she told me I had no right to interfere with her way of raising them. Jonathan went still. A stabbing ache ripped through his chest as memories of Laura flooded back. His late wife reading fairy tales, feeding porridge to Sophie, cradling their children with tender arms. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain even. Did you ever hear her threaten the children? Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I heard it clearly. She told Sophie that if she dared to tell you, both children would be thrown onto the street. She also threatened to fire me if I spoke a word. I am truly sorry, sir. She is far too cunning. Jonathan rested a hand on the back of a chair to steady himself, his body trembling. His voice caught but stayed firm. It is not your fault. From now on, if anything happens, you tell me directly. And Dorothy, if it comes to it, would you be willing to testify? The old woman lifted her head, her tired eyes now burning with resolve. For the children, I am willing. That entire day, Jonathan canceled every meeting, telling his company he had urgent family matters. He roamed through the house like a man inspecting a crime scene. In the children's room, he opened closets, examined blankets, turned over bottles. Each small trace felt like silent evidence screaming against him. Victoria appeared in the doorway, holding a portfolio of investment papers, smiling lightly. "What are you doing?" "You've just returned from a trip and you're pacing all over the house instead of resting." Jonathan shook his head. "We'll talk later. For now, I need to check everything." That evening, he sat in his study, pushing aside all files until only the small framed photo of Laura remained before him. In the lamplight, her gentle face and warm eyes seemed alive again. Jonathan laid his hand on the wooden frame, an apology lodged in his throat. Soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door creaked open, and Sophie appeared, clutching Daniel, who was dozing in her arms. Her eyes were swollen and red, the marks of hours spent crying. Jonathan quickly stood, gently taking Daniel into his arms. The boy felt weightless, his breathing uneven, his tiny body carrying the faint sour scent of diluted milk. Jonathan laid him in the crib, then pulled up a chair for Sophie. But she sat at the very edge, her back stiff, her eyes darting constantly toward the door as though expecting someone to walk in. Jonathan offered her a cup of warm water. "Drink a little, Sophie." She raised it with both hands, sipping a tiny swallow, but her gaze never left the doorway. Jonathan wanted to ask 1,000 questions but held back, afraid even one misplaced word might cause her to retreat further. Instead, he spoke gently, as if laying a warm blanket over her shoulders. "Sit here, where it's warm." Sophie nodded faintly, setting the cup down. As her sleeve slipped back, a long bruise showed across her delicate wrist. Jonathan caught sight of it, but pretended not to notice, his chest tightening. Daniel drifted into slumber, his tiny hand clinging to Jonathan's collar, as if it were his last anchor. Jonathan sat utterly still, not daring to move, afraid to shatter the fragile peace. Then he whispered, just loud enough for Sophie to hear, "You're safe now. Daddy's here." The girl gave a small nod, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak, but chose silence instead. From the hallway, the wind slipped through the crack in the door, rattling faintly. Sophie flinched, curling her hands back out of reflex. Jonathan reached out to rest a reassuring hand on her wrist, but Sophie recoiled slightly, her chair creaking. He froze, then withdrew his hand as though burned. A question stabbed at his heart. Why is my own child afraid of even my hand? Jonathan bent down, his voice deliberate, slow. "Tonight, you'll stay here. I'll be right beside you." Sophie nodded, clutching her small hands together. Jonathan tucked the blanket around Daniel, dimmed the light, and let the room settle into silence. Only the soft breathing of the children remained, fragile but living proof of a vow newly forged in Jonathan's heart. Never again would a single tear fall, because of Victoria. That night, Jonathan Reed hardly slept. He sat in the armchair of his study, the desk lamp casting a weary glow across his hollow face. Every breath from Daniel, every time Sophie shifted restlessly in her chair, cut into his heart like a blade. At daybreak, Jonathan stepped into Laura Reed's old bedroom, a place he had rarely dared to enter since his wife's death. The room still carried a faint trace of her gentle fragrance, like a shadow lingering in the air. He opened the large wooden wardrobe, pulling out drawers one by one. Suddenly, a thin envelope slipped out, caught against the edge. Written across it, in the familiar hand that made his chest tighten, were two words: "To Jonathan." His hands trembled as he tore open the paper. Laura's slanted handwriting appeared, her voice echoing as if beside him. "If I am no longer here, please protect Sophie and Daniel. Do not place your trust too quickly in anyone. When our daughter is afraid, believe her eyes. For in that moment, she will not know how to lie." Jonathan sank to the floor, the letter shaking in his grasp. Sophie's terrified face clinging to Daniel rose vividly in his mind. Her tear-soaked eyes etched into his memory. His chest ached, not the dull guilt he had carried, but a sharp fatherly pain cutting deep. Tears spilled onto the page. His voice cracked into the stillness. "I'm sorry, Laura. From this moment, I will protect them. I swear it." He folded the letter carefully, sliding it into the inner pocket of his jacket, as though sealing a sacred vow. Closing his eyes, leaning against the wardrobe, he let the tears fall freely. But when he rose, his back was straighter. No more running. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jonathan brewed coffee and sat in silence, listening to Dorothy Wilson's footsteps moving about the kitchen. Then Victoria appeared, immaculate in a pale dress, her bright smile practiced to perfection. "Did you sleep well? Today I'll take Sophie to her music class. Let's have an early dinner tonight." Jonathan forced a faint smile. "I'll be staying home today. Keep to your schedule." The entire day he watched quietly. By late afternoon, he heard Victoria's low voice in the garden. Jonathan followed the stone path, hiding behind the row of trees. A stranger entered through the side gate, Robert Hill, a man in a dark overcoat with a leather bag slung over his shoulder. Victoria approached him, her face shifting, no longer gentle, but cold and calculating. "You're right on time. I want to move the trust funds early. Once I secure the authorization, all of it will be mine." Robert frowned. "I need proof you have legal authority. Jonathan's signature is still missing." Victoria's lips curled into a chilling smile. "Don't worry. He's too busy playing the perfect father. I'll get it, one way or another." Jonathan stood behind the trees, his hand clenched so tightly the veins bulged blue. Now he understood. It wasn't just the whispered threats in the dark, nor the bruises on Sophie's wrist. There was also a scheme to seize everything Laura had left behind. Robert exited through the side gate. Victoria adjusted her hair, then returned to the house with a calm, innocent face. Jonathan remained still, but within him 3 unshakable lines carved themselves in iron. Protect the children. Gather the evidence. Call Frank Miller. That evening, in the living room, Sophie stacked wooden blocks into a small castle. But every time a sound came from the kitchen, she froze, her eyes wide with vigilance. Jonathan crouched beside her, picking up a fallen block and placing it in her hand. His voice was low, steady. "You're safe here, with me." Sophie gave a faint nod, her lips forming the quietest whisper. "Yes." Jonathan's hand pressed against the letter in his pocket. Laura's words were no longer a memory. They had become a command written in his very blood. Victoria Lang would never again have the chance to harm his children. That night, Jonathan Reed never left the living room. He stayed beside Sophie and Daniel longer than ever before, watching, listening to each fragile breath. On the carpet, Sophie carefully stacked wooden blocks, occasionally leaning down to soothe her baby brother. But each time footsteps echoed from the hallway, her body tensed, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. Seeing this, Jonathan pulled up a chair beside her, reaching for a fairy tale book from the shelf, the very one Laura used to read to Sophie years ago. He opened it, his voice slow, each word etched into the silence. And at last, the princess found her way home. Sophie looked up, her eyes wide in disbelief, as if she couldn't trust that her father was truly reading to her, something he hadn't done in months. Daniel rested his head against his father's chest, his breathing gradually evening out. Jonathan gently patted the boy's back, his voice warm and steady. "Sleep now. Daddy's here." A rare moment of peace settled over them, but only minutes later, Victoria Lang appeared at the doorway, arms folded, her smile sweet yet false. "It's late, Jonathan. Let me take the children to bed." Jonathan looked up, his tone calm yet firm. "No need. I'll do it." Victoria hesitated for a beat, then shrugged. "As you wish." She turned, leaving behind the sharp trace of her heavy perfume. Moments later, Dorothy Wilson entered carrying a cup of warm milk. She placed it on the table, glanced toward the door, then back at Jonathan with eyes that seemed to whisper, "Don't let them out of your sight." Jonathan nodded. He handed the milk to Sophie, speaking softly. "Drink a little, sweetheart." The girl cradled the cup in both hands, sipping in small gulps. Her eyes still flickered toward the doorway, but this time she allowed her father to gently smooth her hair without pulling away. When the clock struck late, Jonathan lifted Daniel into his arms and guided Sophie to her bedroom. He adjusted the blankets, laid his son in the crib, and watched Sophie settle into the small chair beside the bed. "Daddy's right here. Go to sleep," Jonathan whispered. Sophie nodded faintly, but before closing her eyes, she murmured, "Daddy, you won't leave me. Like she said, will you?" Jonathan froze. The words pierced his heart like a blade. He pulled his daughter close, his voice breaking yet resolute. "Never." "I'm here. Always." The little girl sobbed into his chest, her tiny hands gripping his shirt as though clinging to the last lifeline. Daniel stirred slightly, then slipped back into slumber under the steady rhythm of Jonathan's hand patting his back. Jonathan sat in silence for hours, listening to his children's breathing, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the door. A shadow flickered in the hallway, surely Victoria. But this time he did not feel fear. He pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. His voice was quiet but firm. "Frank, come to my house tomorrow evening. It's about the family trust. And my children." On the other end, Frank Miller, the attorney who had stood by him for years, replied simply, 7 o'clock. "I'll be there." Jonathan ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He sat there, holding both children in his arms, his eyes burning with a new light. That night, he was no longer the businessman fleeing from grief. That night, he had returned, as a father. The following evening, at precisely 7 o'clock, Frank Miller, Jonathan's longtime friend and attorney, arrived at the Evanston estate. A man in his 40s, calm and meticulous, his sharp eyes reflected the experience of someone who had handled countless family cases. Victoria Lang came out to greet him, wearing a refined navy blue dress, her makeup tasteful, her smile graceful. "It's such an honor to meet you, Mr. Miller. Please, come in. Dinner is ready." Frank politely shook her hand, though his eyes quickly shifted toward the corner of the room where Sophie clutched her baby brother tightly. He gave the children a warm smile and a gentle nod. The dining table was elegantly set, crisp white linens, a vase of red roses in the center. Victoria, the picture of attentiveness, placed meat into Sophie's bowl and dabbed Daniel's mouth with a napkin, her smile as sweet as honey. "Eat up, darling, so you'll grow strong." But beneath the table, her hand pressed hard into Sophie's shoulder. The girl trembled, her spoon shaking until soup spilled over the edge. Jonathan, sitting opposite, kept his expression steady, though his heart pounded violently. Frank broke the tense silence. "Jonathan, regarding your investment portfolio, I noticed you're holding too many bonds. Do you need to rebalance? Jonathan gave a slight nod, replying in a measured voice, We need to review the structure of the family trust. I want you to examine every clause. A flicker lit up in Victoria's eyes, but she quickly masked it with a smile, tilting her head sweetly. Mr. Miller, always so thorough. This family is fortunate to have you. When the main course was served, Frank turned briefly to ask the chef about the sauce. In that moment, Victoria leaned down toward Sophie, her whisper sharp as a blade. Remember this. If you say a word, your little brother will pay the price. Sophie froze, her spoon clattering onto the plate. Jonathan saw it all. He drew a long breath, gripping his glass tightly to suppress his rage. After dinner, Victoria rose gracefully. I'll take the children upstairs now. Sophie glanced back at her father, eyes pleading. Jonathan smiled calmly, nodding in reassurance. Go ahead. Daddy will come up later. When the door closed, leaving only Jonathan and Frank, the attorney set down his teacup, leaned back, and lowered his voice. You invited me here. Was it about money? Or something else? Jonathan remained silent for several seconds, his hand tapping a steady rhythm on the table as he steadied himself. Both, but the latter matters more. I want to protect my children. Frank nodded, pulling a small notebook from his briefcase. Then let's start with the truth. Tell me what you've seen. Jonathan spoke in short, controlled fragments. The bruises on Sophie's wrist, the lock on the outside of the bedroom door, the threats whispered on the staircase, and the secret meeting between Victoria and Robert Hill to seize the trust. Frank jotted every detail without interruption. When Victoria returned, her smile intact, she asked casually, Would you like more tea? Frank replied lightly, Thank you. It was very good. As soon as the door shut, he leaned closer to Jonathan, whispering, My friend, your wife is not only mistreating the children, she's after the estate. I'll help you bring the truth into the light. Cook County Courthouse, Chicago. The next morning, Jonathan walked through the courthouse hallway beside Frank, gripping Sophie's small hand. Baby Daniel had been entrusted to a temporary guardian appointed by the court. Across the corridor, Victoria Lang arrived with her attorney, Alan Pierce. She wore a beige dress, carried a tissue, her eyes glistening just enough to perfect the act of a grieving stepmother. The clerk's voice rang out, Case number 14. Reed petitioning for emergency protection of minors. All four stepped inside. Judge Linda Johnson, a woman in her 50s with sharp, observant eyes, presided over the bench. Frank rose. Your Honor, we request an emergency protective order restricting the respondent, Victoria Lang, from contact with the minors on grounds of emotional abuse and neglect. We submit testimony from housekeeper Dorothy Wilson, photographs of the injuries, and a handwritten letter left by the late Mrs. Laura Reed. Allen quickly countered. Your Honor, my client is a devoted stepmother. These claims are speculative, without direct proof. The bruises could be from ordinary childhood accidents. Victoria dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her voice breaking. I did everything I could. He was always away on business, and I carried all the burden myself. Judge Johnson nodded thoughtfully. Call the witness. Dorothy Wilson stepped forward, wringing her hands but speaking firmly. I saw Sophie forced to stand outside on the porch at night. Once, I found her sleeping with her baby brother in the storage room because their bedroom was locked. Daniel was often given watered-down milk until he cried himself to sleep. I also heard Victoria threaten that if Sophie told her father, both children would be thrown out. Alan pressed forward sharply. How old are you? 62? Are you sure your memory isn't failing? Dorothy's reply was steady. I've worked in that home for 10 years. I don't mistake her voice. Alan tried another angle. Do you hold any grudge against my client? Number, I'm only afraid for the children. Frank then presented photographs. Sophie's bruised wrist, time-stamped from recent days. Alan scoffed. Children fall all the time. The photos don't prove who caused them. Frank laid down the letter from Laura. This is not behavioral evidence, but it provides crucial family context. The late Mrs. Reed urged her husband to trust their daughter's eyes when she is afraid, for at that moment, she cannot lie. The judge read a few lines, then nodded. The court acknowledges it. The room grew taut as a drawn bowstring. Then the judge asked, Can the child testify? Frank glanced at Jonathan. The father bent down, whispering to Sophie. You don't have to speak if you're afraid. Daddy is here. Sophie swallowed, her eyes glimmering as she looked at the bench. Then she drew a deep breath. I want to speak. The courtroom fell silent. Sophie walked to the witness stand, her small shoes tapping against the wooden floor. She gripped the railing, her voice trembling but clear. If I told my father, she said she would throw me and my brother out. But I can't stay silent anymore. I don't want my baby brother to grow up in fear. Her voice cracked, but no tears fell. From below, Jonathan lifted a hand to cover his face, tears breaking free. Frank set his pen down, no longer writing. The silence deepened. Judge Johnson gave Sophie a gentle nod. Thank you, child. Alan stammered, Your Honor, a child's words can easily be influenced. Enough. The judge's tone was cold and sharp. At that moment, Victoria suddenly leapt to her feet, her chair screeching back, her eyes blazing red. She's lying. She's just like her mother, always pretending to be saintly. Her scream echoed through the chamber. Security officers immediately stepped forward to restrain her. Judge Johnson struck the gavel. Order. The respondent has threatened a child within this courtroom. It will be entered into the record. Sophie flinched, retreating a step, but Jonathan rushed to her side, resting a hand gently on her back. Daddy's here. The courtroom fell silent after Victoria Lang's scream. Judge Linda Johnson struck her gavel, her stern gaze sweeping the chamber. Based on the witness testimony, the photographs of injuries, the letter left by the late Mrs. Laura Reed, and, above all, the courageous statement of the child, this court issues an emergency protective order. The respondent, Victoria Lang, is hereby suspended from all custody and visitation rights until a final ruling. Temporary custody is granted to the petitioner, Jonathan Reed. The air was thick with tension. Then the judge continued, her voice cold and cutting. This file will also be referred to the Cook County District Attorney's Office for investigation into child abuse and fraudulent conduct related to the family trust assets. The room murmured. Grace Thompson, a social worker, stepped forward, her voice calm. I will coordinate immediately to ensure the children's safety. Sophie squeezed her father's hand. Jonathan nodded, his eyes glistening. Victoria sat in shock, her eyes blazing red. She leapt to her feet, pointing at Sophie, her voice venomous. That little liar, she's just like her mother, always pretending to be so saintly. I hate her, and the boy, too. Her shriek rang through the chamber. Security officers seized her shoulders, forcing her back down. Judge Johnson struck the gavel 3 times. The respondent has threatened a child within this courtroom. It is entered into the record as contempt of court. The respondent will be remanded to custody for 24 hours. Victoria writhed, spitting her fury. "Jonathan, do you think you've won? One day, you'll pay for this." But Jonathan did not answer. He bent down, pulling Sophie into his arms, and when Grace handed him baby Daniel, he clutched both children tightly to his chest. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "No one will ever touch you again. Daddy's here." At his side, Frank Miller laid a hand on his shoulder, silent but steady. Outside in the courthouse corridor, camera flashes exploded, reporters swarming. A young journalist, Anna Mitchell, thrust a microphone forward. "Mr. Reed, do you have any statement for the public?" Frank stepped in, his tone firm. "Make way, please. We're protecting the children's privacy." Jonathan only bowed his head, shielding Sophie and Daniel in his arms like a fortress against the chaos. Far away, escorted through another exit, Victoria glanced back one last time, hissing through clenched teeth. "Laura, in the end, you still won. But I swear, I will never let your husband and children live in peace." 2 years later, Evanston, Illinois. The spring sky was clear and blue. In the backyard garden of the Reed home, a wooden sign hung on the fence. Mama Laura's Garden. Tomato plants stretched tall, golden blossoms glowing in the sunlight. Sophie, now 8, her brown hair tied into a ponytail, held Daniel's hand as he toddled along the brick path. She laughed brightly. "Look, Daniel. The tomato plants are blooming. We'll cook pasta for Daddy tonight." Jonathan sat on a wooden chair, notebook resting on his lap, watching his children play. A soft smile tugged at his lips. Daniel stumbled, his tiny hands smeared with soil, but his face radiant with joy. Sophie steadied him, then called out, "Daddy, I'm the team leader in gardening class now. I told everyone about our garden, and they loved it." Jonathan's eyes blurred with tears. He answered softly, "Tonight, we'll make pasta with the first tomatoes from the garden." From the porch, Dorothy Wilson emerged carrying a tray of warm butter cookies. Her gentle smile deepened by the creases of age. At that moment, Grace Thompson arrived through the gate, holding a file. "I brought the certificate confirming the therapy program is complete. Sophie has made wonderful progress, and Daniel is thriving. And the upcoming hearing will just be a formality to finalize permanent custody." Jonathan shook her hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, not just for your work, but for helping this family stand again." That evening, the three of them shared dinner in the garden. Sophie, playing host, declared with mock solemnity, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's menu is pasta made with tomatoes from Mama Laura's garden." Daniel clapped his little hands, laughing, while Jonathan broke into a warm laugh, his heart full as sunlight. After dinner, Sophie hugged her father tightly and whispered, "Now, we're really a family, aren't we, Daddy?" Jonathan wrapped his arms around her, answering firmly, "Yes, and we always will be." Daniel clung to his father's legs, and the three of them folded into one long embrace. Their shadows stretched across the grass, blending into a single shape. Jonathan lifted his gaze toward the wooden sign glowing in the twilight. He brushed his fingers across Laura's name and whispered, "I kept my promise." The story closes with the image of a father reclaiming his sacred role, 2 children stepping out of the shadows, and a garden blooming in memory of a mother's love. The message is clear: the wicked will be punished. Truth and courage bring justice, and unconditional love is the only force strong enough to heal every wound. And this was the journey of Jonathan Reed and his 2 children, Sophie and Daniel. A story of tears, but also of hope, that when a father chooses to stand up, justice, love, and healing will always find their way home. Now I want to ask you, which moment touched your heart the most? Was it Sophie's trembling plea, "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore"? Laura's heartfelt letter? Or Sophie's brave words in court, "I can't stay silent anymore"? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to read them. If you believe in stories that touch the heart, hit like to spread the message, and subscribe to True Tale Time so you don't miss the next journey. Don't forget to ring the bell, because the next story may be the one that keeps you thinking all night. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Drink some water, hug your loved ones, and I'll see you again in the next story of True Tale Time.